Let's go.
There we go. Hi, good evening, everyone. Afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world. Hello and welcome. My name is Ashley Duker, and alongside my dear friend, Giles Lindsay. Hi, Giles.
Hi, Ash.
We lead, surprise, the Agility Leadership Network. And it's for Agilists by Agilists. So it's good to see a lot of familiar faces on the line. And those of you that are new, welcome. It's great to have you here for the first time. So tonight we have the one and only Simon Wardley doing a bit of a talk and a fireside chat with us. And he's got some awesome stuff to share, and then also has options to dive deeper into certain areas as we wish as an audience, right? So he'll be exploring things around organizational complexity, situational awareness, and using mapping to navigate this, and a lot more. So Simon has taken this home for us tonight. You are the third speaker on this mini series, as we've been calling it, of this organizational complexity series that Nigel Thurlow kicked off last year, arguing organizational complexity is human derived, quite provocative. And then Dave Snowden a couple of weeks ago shared an ecological approach to leadership in Agile. And Simon, you're just really wrapping this up for us this week. So we're really excited to have you here. For those of you who don't know Simon, and I doubt there's anyone on this call that doesn't know Simon, but for those of you that don't, he's a former CEO, advisory board member of startups who are all now acquired by US giants, a fellow of Open Europe, and inventor of Wardley Mapping, which I'm pretty sure everyone on this call is quite familiar with. You're a regular conference speaker and a researcher for the Leading Edge Forum. So we have, I think, Simon, you said your talk's about 40 minutes tonight, and then we'll go into a nice Q&A as we normally do. And then after this, I think those of you that were on the call last time are familiar with, we're building up to a bit of a panel event. So that's going to happen a month away. On the 8th of March, we'll get the flyer up, and that'll be a panel on bringing together organizational complexity and diving into some quite niche and thought-provoking topics. So the questions you ask here can help us tailor the seed questions that we have with the panel. So Mike Levings, you really kicked that panel off for us with Nigel's talk, so thank you. So please, ask your questions, and they really help shape things for us in Agility Leadership Network, and also just make it a really good and interesting time. So we'll do 40 minutes roughly with Simon, and then go into Q&A, and Giles and I will do the standard fielding the questions. Feel free to type as you go throughout as Simon talks, but then at the end, we'll ask you to use the raise hand functionality. And then if you're comfortable, come off mic and turn on your videos, and please just ask your questions directly to Simon. And Giles will help field these, and I'll help field these too. So without further ado, Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much. Absolute delight to be here. We've got the ability to put emotions or emotes or reactions on Zoom. Can you wave a hand or something if you've regularly used mapping? Just want to get an idea of how many people. 1, 2. Okay. Some of you. All right. Is it fair to say that most of you are not familiar with my form of mapping? Raise a hand if that's the case, physically, so I can see you.
So there's a few.
There's a few.
Yeah. And there's a few people doing the hand twisty thing as well.
Not sure. Okay, fine. All right, super. Thank you. So what I'll do then is I'll do basic introduction into mapping to make sure everybody's at the same sort of level. We'll go through a couple of patterns, etc. And then we can start exploring things like organization. We can go into areas like culture, even issues of national sovereignty, if we wish to. At any point anybody wants to interrupt, ask questions, if it's going too slow, whatever, just tell me and we can accelerate it accordingly. Okay, I'm going to share a screen. Can you see that? Hopefully it should say crossing the river by feeling the stones.
Correct. Yep.
Perfect. All right. So I like that phrase. That phrase came from Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, a famous Chinese leader economist. And it's all about having a purpose and direction, and not so much having a plan as in adapting according to what you discover as you go along. Now, all of this work, by the way, is Creative Commons, share alike. So anything you see here, please help yourself. And you'll find all the mapping stuff is freely available online. So I'm going to start with the origin of maps, or origin of my journey into mapping. Then I'm going to talk about maps themselves and what actually makes a map. And then I'm going to talk about patterns, after which we'll get into organizational structure. We'll talk a little bit about culture and sovereignty. Now, I put the last bits as dotted lines because it all depends upon how many questions you have, how far we get into things. So let's start with the origin. For me, mapping started 17 years ago. Oh, gosh. I was working at this company for Tango. It was an online photo service, about 16 different lines of business, very successful, very, very profitable, but it had a problem. And that problem was the CEO. The CEO was clueless. They were making it up as they went along. They didn't have any understanding of the space, despite the fact the company was profitable. I know this because I was the CEO. So I like to call myself a fake CEO. So I've built companies, sold companies, but certainly in the early days, I had no idea what I was really doing. I used to come up with these wonderful statements. This was us in 2003. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. And I've highlighted some of the words in bold because literally they were just common words people used. I'd taken this actually from another company and just changed a few things. You know, that's how bad I was. So I used to go around recording other CEOs talking about their vision, their strategy for the future. I was always hoping to find those sort of magical words which would, help me understand or help me enthuse people more. So I used to look for those common words. I called them business level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or BLAS for short. And I've done this every couple of years. This was probably about 2012, 2013, common BLAS being used, digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, open source. If you used it today, you'd probably hear words like blockchain, AI. That AI would be a common one today. So what I also did was I created something called the BLA template. Our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I used to just smash the words together with the BLA template in the hope that it would generate some sort of fabulous strategy for the future. Things like this. So well, every time I do this, I normally generate, 50 or 60 of them. This is a particular run. I generated 64. So number one was our strategy is customer focus. We will lead a disruptive effort of the market through our use of innovative social media. And I can barely say the words. It's that painful, but it's just pure gibberish. But I sent these around and I got about 400 responses when I did this. This was the second one. Our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer, again, painful. I can barely say the words. Anyway, the responses I got back were probably the most common is this is the exact wording from our business plan. People had identified one, which was identical to their business plan. Two, I've seen two of these used already. And three was the most amusing one is, are you for hire? So I knew I was making it all up, despite the fact our revenue were growing, we're being very profitable. But I started to get this idea I might not be the only one. Now, a friend of mine's put this all online, by the way. This is strategy as a service. If you ever need strategy, you just type in the URL. It will automatically create you one based upon nothing whatsoever. If you want, you can pretend there's blockchain and AI behind it, if that makes you feel more comfortable. So our strategy is collaborative. We will lead an open effort to the market through our use of big data and social media. It's just like painful words. If you don't like it, it's pretty simple. You just press refresh and keep going until you find one that you actually like. Anyway, so that's where I was. That was the level of strategy in my organization. Hopeless. And I ended up reading every book I could find on strategy and getting absolutely nowhere. And I was in London in a particular bookstore near Charing Cross. And I was talking to the bookseller, and she asked me, had I ever read The Art of War by Sun Tzu? And the answer was, I hadn't. So she persuaded me to buy 2 different versions because they're all translations. And I'm so grateful for that, because it's actually the second reading that I noticed a particular pattern. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that matter in competition. 1, understand your purpose, your moral imperative. 2, understand the landscape you're competing in. 3, understand the climatic patterns. So this is like the heavens, so the weather, or in economic terms, the economic rules, how that is changing the system. Then you understand doctrine, principles of organization, and then you get into the leadership bit, which is gameplay. I thought, okay, this sort of makes sense. And then I came across John Boyd. And John Boyd, the Mad Major US Air Force pilot, came up with something called the OODA loop. So you have the game, your purpose. You have the first O, which is to observe. And that's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. It's understanding the environment and how it's changing. Then you orientate yourself around that space. That's what doctrine and principles are around. And then you decide where you're going to attack, and then you act. And that's where gameplay comes to the fore. And so I was fascinated by this, and people kept on asking me, telling me, actually it doesn't matter. What's really important is the why. Well, there's 2 whys here. There's the why of purpose, my moral imperative to do something, and the why of movement. I make this choice over that choice? And I find the best way to explain this is with a game of chess. So the why of purpose might be to win the game. The why of movement is, do I move this piece or that piece? And it's through movement and action we actually learn about the space we exist in, as long as we can perceive the environment. This is why landscape is so important. So I got quite excited about this. This must have been 2005. I mean, I've run those experiments years and years afterwards as well. And I started reading everything I could about maps, which brings me to the next part of the talk. So particularly fond of military history, because in military history, they've used maps to learn basic moves and patterns. So one of my favorites is, this is the Battle of Thermopylae. So Themistocles was an ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. The Persians were invading, about 140 to 170,000 Persians. Used the navy to block off the Straits of Artemisium, forced the Persians along a coastal road into a narrow pass called Thermopylae, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. And there are about 4,000 Greeks in the Greek army against this 140,000 plus, including in those 4,000, there were about 300 Spartans. And this is where we get the story of the 300 from. I looked at this and I thought, well, this is a great way of telling multiple different groups what we're going to do, communicating with each other, and also talking about, whether it's the sensible move to make. And then I started looking inside my organization. And I was thinking, well, how do we make decisions? And at that time, we were using a lot of SWOT diagrams. So I decided to do the SWOT of the Battle of Thermopylae. So the strengths, a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses, the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities, get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we actually hate the Spartans. And the threats, the Persians get rid of us. And the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. And I looked at that SWOT diagram, and I just put it next to the map. And I asked myself the question, what would you use to communicate, determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by some sort of map or some sort of framework like a SWOT. And I realized, of course, I'm going to use a map. But I also realized that what I was using was a framework. So I thought, right, I need to start using maps. So I started asking everybody in the organization, bring me all your maps. And they would bring me loads of maps, things like a business process map, mind maps. People had lots of different mind maps, and systems maps. And I started to look at these and I thought, well, they've got to be like these sort of vehicles that we're using, military history. Is this the same? So this is actually a systems map for the online photo service. I mean, it was obviously a bit more complex than this. We had 16 different lines of business. But anyway, I took the map and I took a component, CRM, and I moved it across the map. And I thought, well, how has that map changed? And the answer is, it hasn't. This is identical to this. But I looked at a geographic map and I thought, well, if I move something, like if I take, I don't know, the US and put it next to, say, England, that's fundamentally changed that map. So why hasn't it changed here? And the answer is because it's not a map, it's a graph. I'm afraid we keep using that word map, and I'm afraid it doesn't mean what we think it means. So to explain the difference, this is a graph. Nottingham, London, Dover connected by 2 roads, the M1, M2, 3 places in the UK. Now, this is a map. Fundamental difference is I've added a compass. What does that mean? It suddenly means space has meaning. And this is what makes a map a map. Because in this way of looking at things, space has meaning. They're very good for understanding landscapes. It doesn't matter whether it's geographic or political or economic. So let's explore that difference a little bit more. These 3 graphs are the same at the top. They're all identical. These 3 maps are completely different. That's the impact of having space having meaning. So the 3 at the top as graphs, all the same. 3 at the bottom, completely different because they're maps. The key characteristics of a map are anchor, position, and movement. So magnetic north, position of pieces, this is north, south, east, or west of that, and consistency of movement. If I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I'm going south. Okay. So I started off mapping a whole bunch of things. And one of my favorite examples is a tea shop. The first maps I produced was, again, as I said, 17 years ago. So this, if you start thinking about a tea shop, what am I going to map? Well, first of all, I need an anchor. So I'm going to take the public as an anchor because we hopefully will have people coming to my tea shop, and the business itself. And they both have needs. So the public hopefully have a need for a cup of tea, and the business has a need to sell cups of tea. Great. The cup of tea has needs. It needs tea, it needs a cup, it needs hot water. Hot water needs a kettle, needs cold water. A kettle needs power. So what you've got is a partially ordered chain of needs. Anchor at the top and a partially ordered chain of needs underneath it. Now, the further you go down the chain, the less visible something becomes further up it. So, for example, to a member of the public, the cup of tea is very visible to them, whereas the power used to heat the kettle is not very visible at all. Now, that gives me anchor and position. I also need movement. So how do you do movement? Well, that's a problem. In geographic terms, it's pretty straightforward. I'm going north, south, east, or west. And it's easy because in geographic terms, places are unlikely to move during your journey time. Now, if you were going to take, say, 300 or 400 million years to go from Thermopylae to Thebes, then that could be a problem, okay? Because this is the world 200 million years ago. Because our journey time is relatively quick compared to the movement of the landscape around us, we pretty much ignore that impact. Now in the technology space, it's not so easy, because if you take something like computing, it was started in 1943, Z3. By 60 years later, you've got the introduction of utility forms of computing with Amazon. So what you've got is rapid movement or change of the market in a period of 60 years, not 200 million years. So you're going to see that impact. So how do you describe movement? Well, you're going to have to describe movement through the concept of change itself. I started off with a chap called Everett Rogers, Diffusion of Innovation. Hopefully everybody's familiar with these concepts. So what happens with diffusion of innovation, it's all about how something spreads in a social system from early adopters to later adopters and laggards. It's a very useful model, but it's got a slight problem. And that problem is that when we talk about technology, or in fact, when we talk about any form of capital, it doesn't diffuse through one curve. You have multiple waves of diffusion, of ever improving instances. So you start off with, say, a phone, and it spreads to 100% adoption of its applicable market. And then you get a better phone, and then a better phone, and then a better phone, each time spreading to, potentially a larger applicable market. So you have multiple waves of diffusion. Same in biological systems. So you think about viruses, they diffuse, but also you get a constant evolution of viruses and multiple waves of diffusion. So in terms of technology, what I started thinking about was, how do I determine when something's a product and when it's, say, a commodity? Particularly since you could have multiple waves of diffusion of ever-improving products, and there could be hundreds of these. And then it would take you, you could have a wave, which was the utility. How do I know which one's the utility? How do I know when we go from, say, the first invention of something to creating a product? The answer is, there's no way of doing it. Or so I thought. It turns out if I looked at publication types, I could find a particular pattern which enabled me to identify how something was evolving in terms of not only its ubiquity to a particular applicable market, but also certainty, how well understood it was. And that is summarized in this diagram here. So it turns out capital evolves through some basic stages. We start off with the genesis of the novel and new, custom-built examples, then we get products, and then rental services, and then eventually commodity and utility services. And as one thing evolves through these different stages, it will go through hundreds, potentially, diffusion curves. Now, this is pretty straightforward. It's pretty obvious once you start to see it. So I thought, right, well, that describes change. So I can use that as my axis of movement at the bottom. So now what I've got is anchor, position, and movement. I simply have to go through and say, is hot water a commodity or is it a product? Okay, and people just put down where they think something is. And that's a basic map. Now, what it means is other people can come along, look at that map, and they can go, well, you're missing components like staff. And somebody else would say, oh, well, actually, you want more commodity form, maybe robots. Somebody else might say, oh, those are stocks of capital. The lines represent flows. So we can start putting metrics to this and start building P&Ls. Somebody else might say, why are we using custom-built kettles, not standard kettles? And somebody might go, well, it's because of brand exclusivity. The point about this is it doesn't matter whether you're from finance, development, operations, or you're from marketing. We can all talk about the same space using a common language, a map. So let's show you one example of use. This happens to be an insurance company. This is 2011, roughly. Maybe 2012, they were about to spend a bucket load of money on robots because they had a particular process flow. They needed compute. They would all have servers. Servers would go into goods in. They'd modify, mount, rack those servers. They needed to improve this process flow because there was a bottleneck. And so it was many millions of capital. They'd spent 6 months selecting vendors, all this sort of stuff, and they were ready to go. And they asked me, what did I think? So I've got a problem here, an immediate problem, because I can't challenge them on why they're doing robots, because they've built a story, a narrative. And the problem with narrative is that when you go into an organization, you generally find that people believe that good leaders are great storytellers. In fact, we thrust that message through training courses, HBR magazines, etc., which means when you challenge somebody's story, you're actually saying you're not a good leader. That's problematic. So what I said is, let's map it out, because what I can do is I can challenge the map without challenging the person. So they grumbled, and then they spent about 15 minutes, and they went, user needs compute, compute order server, server goods in, compute rack, mount, modify, and they created a map. Now I can now challenge the map. And so I simply asked, okay, that looks really interesting. Order server, server goods in. I can see commodity, compute you put in product. I'm not sure I would agree with, but rack. Why have you got rack in custom built? Turns out they had their own custom built racks. And so I said, well, okay, you've got a company making your racks. What are your modifications you're doing to the service? Well, they don't fit our racks. So we'd have to take cases off, drill new holes, add new plates. And that's why you need robotics, yes. And somebody in the room just went, hang on, why don't we use standard racks? And of course, once that conversation happened, it wasn't long before we had a conversation on using just cloud. So this is probably the most common problem that I see, people optimizing process flow when they really should be thinking about evolutionary flow. Now, these people weren't daft, they just can't see the environment. We're often trapped by context and stories. We can't see the environment, so we don't realize that this is what needs to change. Okay. Now, this sort of stuff we've used in UK government. This is one particular project. We saved about, well, it's going to be estimated about 1.5 billion in its lifetime. More recent ones, like the NASA Carbon Mapper satellite, which was coordinated between NASA, Planet, and others. That was using mapping, as in this form of mapping, to get everybody to work together. And a common one I use is HS2, high-speed rail. Not the a project which emotes all sorts of feelings in the UK, but there's one bit I particularly like, which is the building of HS2 in a virtual world. So this is James Finley, former CIO of HS2, needed to build the entire railway in a virtual world. That's his systems diagram, all the different components that are actually needed. And James was, his problem was, right, how do I build this thing? I mean, some of the stuff I could use agile techniques, some of the stuff I could use off-the-shelf products, some of the stuff, you know, outsource to maybe utility providers. This was about 2012. Now, James's problem is those three questions in this diagram is 387 million possible permutations. So how do you answer that? What you do? So what we did, or used to do in government, was outsource the whole lot, because that was just easier, to be frank. And that's a really bad thing to do, and I'll explain why in a minute. So we'd outsource it all. We tend to break it up into small contracts, because we lump things together because they sounded similar. So we'd have like lot one engineering things, would outsource that in that contract, lot two user experience. Anyway, James decided to do something different. Sunday afternoon, he sat down and he just mapped the whole lot out. Sent me the map. I had a look at the map. I just modified it slightly. And he said, right, how do we manage this stuff? And I said, this is really simple. Had this problem back in 2005. What you've got with a map is as things evolve from left to right, their characteristics change. So they start in this uncharted space, being chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable. Money, penicillin, computing, doesn't matter, all starts there. Over time, it becomes more industrialized, ordered, known, measured, stable, dull, and boring. Now, because of that, there's no such thing as one-size purchasing methods, and there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all project management methods. So things like extreme programming in-house development, very strong on the left-hand side because change is the norm. And that's what you've got to reduce the cost of, change. Whereas stuff on the right-hand side, once it's evolved, once it's industrialized, we want to reduce deviation. So Six Sigma outsourcing is good for that. And stuff in the middle, you're still learning. So we want to learn and reduce waste. And for that, things like lean have turned out to be really good. MVP, all that sort of stuff. So you just take this and apply it. So you take your map and you go, right, stuff on the left, agile techniques, build in-house, stuff in the middle, off-the-shelf products, stuff on the right, outsource to utility providers. And of course, as stuff evolves, you just change the methods, that's all. So very simple principle, use appropriate methods. This entire project was delivered way ahead of schedule, way under budget, which for HS2, it ended up in the Public Accounts Committee being praised for this stuff. Let me go back to how we would have normally done it. If I look at this contract structure, and I'll take one contract, lot one engineering, and I'll overlay that lot one engineering onto the map, I can tell you this contract will fail before we've even signed it. And the reason why it will fail is that stuff on the right-hand side will be efficiently treated because we can actually specify it in a contract, and the stuff on the left-hand side would always incur excessive change control costs. And because we don't really know what we want. And that's the problem with the contract. We're doomed to failure, mass cost overruns. This stuff costs us hundreds of millions, if not billions every year. And it's very easy to sell. So this is probably the third most common problem I find. The first is obviously evolutionary flow. People not thinking about how evolved something is, just concentrating on process flow. The second is getting your methods mixed up. So people going Six Sigma everywhere, Agile everywhere. That's no good. And the third is contract structures. Once you map them out, overlay, most of them usually a horrendous mess. Anyway, we learn these basic patterns by doing what we call Premortem challenge. So you do the map and somebody goes, oh, you're missing stuff, or your cup of kettle should be more of a commodity. And then we'll go and do stuff. And then afterwards, we'll do post-mortem learning. And we'll do learning on the map itself. So we'll take the map, it's an artifact that we use, constantly changing. So we'll go and build the stuff and then we'll update it with what we found. And that's how we learn patterns. No different from playing a game of chess. Movement, action, we learn patterns as long as we can perceive the environment. So anyway, with that said, I've already inserted a pattern into your minds. And I'll just demonstrate this with the help of a self-driving car. But this is a special self-driving car. This is the Elvish self-driving car. So what I've got is a systems diagram of a self-driving car, which I've translated neatly into Elvish. So this is the sort of stuff that we use often in organizations. And so now I'm going to ask you a question. Should we outsource or build our own A, and the same for B? So A, if you put into chat or something like that, who thinks we should outsource or build our own? Okay. Build, no idea. Right. I love the no ideas because honestly, most project structures and ways of doing things and contracts, really, they should just say, we have no idea what we're doing. So I'm going to give you the same thing. I'm now going to cheat. I'm going to turn it into a map. Okay. So there's the map. Exactly the same thing, but now not a graph anymore. It's now a map. So if I ask you the question, A, should we outsource or build our own? What do you say? Outsource. Yeah. It's much easier, isn't it? And I've provided you no additional information other than the fact that, an understanding of the landscape or how evolved the components are. Build B, outsource A, simple. Right, good. So then you get into patterns. Now there's an awful lot of patterns with maps. The first lot are known as the climatic patterns. So these are basically the rules that influence the game. And there's 30 of these, and we're certainly not going to cover them all. I'll do a couple of simple ones. User needs an application. application built on best coding practice for runtime on an operating system, using best architectural practice for compute as a product. So this is compute, general development circa 2005, maybe 2006. On a map, you can have not only physical activities, but practices, data, knowledge as well. They all evolve through 4 common stages. It should be called stage 1, 2, 3, 4. We just have different labels for things. So when we talk about practices, novel, emerging, good, and best. Okay, so this is a map circa 2005. The first pattern you learn is that everything evolves. If there is supply and demand competition, everything moves from left to right. So we knew in 2005, for example, that compute would become a utility. In fact, they knew that 20 years before then. Okay. So the second pattern you learn is that past success breeds inertia. So if we've got pre-existing capital, and that could be physical capital, it could be practices, then we're going to have inertia to this change. And so the classic example of that is Blockbuster Netflix. So first with a website, first with video streaming, first with ordering videos online. Well, that was Blockbuster. First to go bankrupt, well, that was also Blockbuster as well. Netflix was a mail order DVD company. But it succeeded in streaming because it didn't have the inertia to this change. Despite the fact that Blockbuster out-innovated everyone, they made their money from late fees, and that required physical stores. So they had huge internal struggles. Next pattern you learn is coevolution. As things evolve, practices change. So as compute became a utility, we got a new set of practices. Same with financial systems, same with mechanical engineering. As things evolve, you get new practices. Eventually, those new practices got called DevOps, but that's okay. Next pattern you learn is efficiency enables innovation. As stuff industrializes, you get new higher order systems, you get bricks, you build houses much more easily. We call that the adjacent unexplored. Because those are things which are generally sort of novel and new. And then higher order systems create new sources of value and worth. So as compute became a utility, you get things like Netflix, which becomes the whole streaming video becomes a huge market. Now I use these patterns for investment. So back in 2008, I used to run strategy for a company called Canonical. They provide something called Ubuntu. We simply mapped out the space, looked at where to invest in terms of this 2008. We knew that cloud was going to be the future. We knew there'd be emerging practice. We didn't know it was going to be called DevOps. We knew there would be new things appearing. So that's where we'd focus, and also where not to invest. Don't focus on the old stuff behind inertia barriers. Pretty straightforward. Okay. And it cost us what? $500,000, took 18 months. We were 2-3% of the operating system against Red Hat, Windows. We ended up 70% of all cloud. I mean, literally $500,000 to take pretty much all of cloud. Now, those are powerful forces, by the way. I mention them most commonly because as things evolve, it's about efficiency. The emerging practices give you speed. The new needs give you new value. And if you are in competition with others, and you've got the benefits of efficiency, speed, new value, you put pressure on everybody else to adapt. And of course, as everybody else adapts, the pressure mounts. So you have zero choice over evolution, none. Okay, that's the Red Queen effect. And the emerging practice eventually got a name, DevOps, 2008, 9, 10, something like that. Then 2014, roughly, runtime shifted from a product to a utility with things like Lambda. We're getting exactly the same things occurring, efficiency, new emerging practice, finally got a name. It's going to be FinOps, apparently, and new needs being created. And of course, we've got inertia to the change. So lots of companies saying, oh, this is just for startups and all that sort of stuff. Startups like, I don't know, Liberty Mutual, heavily pushing serverless. They're a 1912 startup. Or they say it's not for big things. Well, iRobot, which has about 13 million robots out there, all communicating with Lambda. It doesn't use any EC2 instances, certainly none of that Kubernetes stuff. And it entirely runs on about 30 AWS function services and 100 Lambda functions, managed by about 6 people. So that's another pattern you learn, but this is not a climatic pattern, not a rule of the game. This is a principle, and the principle is that strategy is iterative. So if you were going to play the game today, you'd focus on serverless and the emerging practices. Things like DevOps, cloud are today's new legacy, or heading towards new legacy. Best architectural practice on compute data centers is like almost ancient. But so where you would target in 2008 is, of course, obviously very, very different from where you would target today. This is a slightly more complex form of that map, which we use for identifying, so dated this time. So 2020, compute best architectural practice and liability, you should already be exiting cloud and DevOps. You should be focused on serverless and the practices developing on top. All right. So climatic patterns are useful for anticipation of change, where you need to target, where you need to go. Then we get into doctrine. Now there's about 40 of these, and they are universally applicable principles regardless of context. So climatic patterns will happen to you, doesn't matter what you do, because it's driven by supply and demand competition. Doctrine are principles that you can choose whether to apply them or not, but they turn out to be universally useful. So it's a good idea to apply them in all cases. And then there's a whole bunch of contextual patterns. They're called gameplay. So there's about 40 of these. I'll just use the HS2 example just to explain a few. So there's HS2 systems graph, not very useful. First thing you do is focus on the users. So when you map, you do this as well. You extract the users, put them at the top. And that turns out to be a universally useful principle. It's quite amazing. The next one you focus on is not just the users. It's a good idea to think about the user needs. So when I wrote something called the Better for Less paper with Liam Maxwell and others, this was Francis Maud in 2009, 2010, supported the creation of something called GDS in UK government and spend control. There's a big emphasis on focusing on users and user needs. But whilst that's good, it's not enough. You've got to understand the details. So you've got to understand the components underneath that. And that's not enough, because that's like, well, we need a kettle, but we need to know if it's custom built or commodity. So we need to also understand what is being considered. So how evolved those components are. So that's another principle. And once you've got that, now we have a common language, which is another principle, and we can challenge assumptions. And then we can start applying using appropriate methods. Now there's about 40 of these, and they all build on top of each other. Most organizations are pretty fairly atrocious at this. Most of them have very poor understanding of their users, the user needs. And when you get into the value chain, it starts to, well, we've seen this with the supply chain problems. People had no idea, the interconnectedness of their supply chains. And then, of course, then it comes to the how evolved the components are. And this is why people struggle with methods and purchasing, trying to do one-size-fits-all purchasing, for example. So once you get good at those, then you get into the gameplay bit. So this is the fun, exciting bit where we start manipulating the map to our favor. There's about 30 climatic patterns, 40 doctrines, about 110 different forms of gameplay. So these are all context specific. Things like open source, great for accelerating things across the map, increases supply and demand competition. That makes no difference when you're creating something novel and new, Genesis. So one of my favorite play is a play called ILC. Oh, I don't know if it's my favorite actually, but it's common. It's used by certain people. So very simply, you take something, a product, you turn it into a utility. So you expose that utility to others, and then they build on top. That's basic componentization effect. So if we take compute, you turn compute into a utility, people build on top. The thing about people building on top is you have to build them. billing them, literally the act of billing them is information about who's growing. So what you can do is you can mine the metadata to spot future patterns which you commoditize to new component services. So I take compute, turn it into a utility, everybody cheers, they can build lots of exciting things on top. I see lots of them building big data systems. So I produce something like Elastic Map Reduce. Everybody cheers, except for the people you just harvested their business model. Everybody else is cheering because they can more quickly build on top. So it's very simple. You get everybody else to innovate for you. You mine the metadata, so you leverage the entire ecosystem to spot future patterns, and you commoditize to component services. Now, your apparent rate of innovation is now proportional to the size of the ecosystem building on top of you, as well as your customer focus, because you're mining metadata to give people what they want, and your efficiency is just economies of scale. So I wrote this in 2005, 2006, because the old porters, you could do one of these three things. It was easy to break it. And this is actually a modified version of Amazon Map. They talk about compute, machine learning engines, machine learning platforms, discrete services, how they basically, Amazon plays the game of moving up the right-hand side, commoditizing those components. If you ever read their book, Reaching Cloud Velocity, which is AWS's second ever book, you'll find about 17 pages of mapping in there, including the NLC model, because you can use this to tear up industry after industry after industry after industry. It's really simple. Okay. So now origin maps patterns. Let's talk about organization. I'll start you with Fatango. This is how I used to be organized. There was me at the top. I had, IT department, finance, etc. Lots of people. Blue's just a representation of a group, a number of people, each of the circles, I should say. And there would be lots of fighting. I used to find lots of fighting between these different groups. And in fact, fighting within the group. So I thought to myself, and I came up with this idea, must be 2003, 2004, that what I would do is we seem to have fighting between these silos. I would create these small sort of teams with somebody in charge, a product owner, and that would get rid of the fighting. And what it did was create more fighting, now actually within those groups. I was sort of puzzled by this. I thought, I eventually realized the problem is that we seem to be dealing with old and new stuff in these groups. And so what I will do is I will split the organization into those dealing with the new and those dealing with the old. Because, obviously that sounds like a really, really sensible idea to do. So it must have been about 2004, about 8 years before Gartner came up with bimodal. Anyway, the net effect was all-out warfare within the organization, almost broke the organization. Everybody fighting with everybody else. 2005, I had maps. So I'll just show you what went wrong. We had these core components, which then the development team or a development group or whatever it happened to be would be building on top. And of course, their stuff would be evolving. So they would turn up and say to the core group, you look after this. The core group would go, where's the documentation? And there'd be an almighty argument and fight and blah, blah, blah. And so the net effect was nothing was evolving. And so the dev team would go and get bored and go start building on new components, on these underlying components, which were basically unreliable. We had a bit of this issue going on with a company called Netflix, which Ruslan sorted out. But what we had was basically increasing instability in the system, open warfare between these different groups. And it was all because there was this missing middle. Foolishly, in my decision to break the organization in this way, I de-emphasized the important transition. I'd emphasize the extremes. And so it was no surprise, created, warfare. So, in 2000, 2005 to 2006, I implemented a structure, a very badly named structure, Pioneer Settlers Town Planners, to cope with this concept of evolutionary flow. So with a long set of characteristics and particular things like mindsets. And so pioneers cope with the constant failure, constant changing, very happy in that world. Settlers were very, very good at taking something and turning it into a useful thing, listening to customers, etc. And town planners were brilliant at industrializing to the nth degree. I mean, you look at an organization like Amazon, most of it is like probably the settler town planner scale. So this is what we implemented, reorganized the entire company, chief pioneer, chief settler, chief town planner. So now we had groups running across, say like IT, finance, marketing. They were groups of competency, whereas the main organizational structure was whether you were a pioneer. You could be pioneer finance, pioneer, engineer, whatever it happened to be, or whether you're more of a settler or a town planner. And all three of these sort of approaches were incredibly important for the entire system. And so what we used to do is then now organize cells with of a similar type. So if we're building, something generally novel and new, we'd get pioneers together. If we're building something which was more of a product which we wanted to develop, we'd get more of the settlers together. If we industrialize, more of the town planners. Now the key to the whole system, there's several keys, 2006. The first is the system of theft. So the system of theft is the town planners can steal any work from the settlers, and the settlers can steal any work from the pioneers. And the point of that is it forces people to move on. It's not a push system as in the pioneers give to the settlers, it's a theft system. So the settlers have to steal, and sometimes they'll steal from the pioneers and throw it away just to force the pioneers to get to move on, because what happens, each group builds inertia, so you have to overcome that. The second thing is that it's self-selecting. So you don't go to somebody and say, we've decided you're a pioneer. People choose. Everybody in the organization chooses where they wish to be and can change their mind. And it's really important to let people choose and let them change their mind. The other thing, it doesn't work unless you've got maps. if you can't describe the environment, it's pretty hopeless. So what you do is you take a complex environment, in this case complex and complicated environment, you map it out, you break things down into small teams, as small as possible. On the right-hand side, when things are more industrialized, teams no more than, Amazon does the 2 pizzas at 12 people, maybe a little bit more. On the left-hand side, usually teams of 3 or 4 at most. So you break it down into small teams, apply the right, make sure you've got people with the right attitude in that particular space, as well as the right skill sets. And then the system of theft basically moves everything from left to right. Now, if you want to read more about that, GCHQ has a document called Boiling Frogs. You'll recognize some of my stuff there. You've got research innovation, specialist product portfolio, commodity, it's exactly the same thing. Pioneers, settlers, town planners, just slightly different words. This is how to cope with an environment which is under constant threat and changing. Okay, and it's a fabulous document, published in 2016 by GCHQ, so do go and read it. At that point, I can get on to culture, and then if you wish, sovereignty. But it all depends on how you're feeling. Do you want to ask a few questions? Is this okay, or shall I keep on going?
It's a great natural pause, because we are at about 7:30. So I was actually going to ask the same thing, Simon. It's so engrossing. It's so wonderful, though, listening to everything you have to share. We have a lot of people saying positive things, and Nigel Thurlow just sent a link in. Oh, thanks, Nigel.
Please continue.
Please continue.
Okay.
Great, through to culture sovereignty. Awesome.
Well, yeah.
You have it.
Okay. We'll get to culture then. All right. So the reason why I bring the culture one up is often, if I go back one, if I look at something like that, people go, oh my gosh, that's just too difficult. I can't think. I've got to think about the users. I've got to understand the needs. I've got to understand all the components that are actually involved. I've then got to consider how evolved those components are. Then I've got to use this to break it into small teams and apply the right attitude and say, oh, this is just like two. Can you not give me like a 2x2, which just gives me a button and I just have to press the button or whatever, you know? People just go, I just can't go. Okay. Well, you can. And honestly, you should. Because if you can't map the space out, you shouldn't be trying to manage it. But you don't try and map it all yourself, then you give it to others, you know, who work with others. That's the point about having a common language, etc. But so what people often say to me is, can't you just tell us how to have the right culture? So we don't have to do this, it will just magically appear. It's like the great reorganization. Sorry, there's a lot of cynicism in my voice. So this brings me to culture. So I'll take something like HS2, high speed rail. I said there's a principle there. So Doctrine is our collection of principles, okay? So these are like things that, you know, context, universally useful patterns. Things like use appropriate methods, focus on user needs, focus on the user, understand the value chain, okay? But on this map, there are also two different beliefs. Principle and beliefs are different things. So belief on the right-hand side is about process over people. So that's the world of Six Sigma. It's all about the method. On the left-hand side, extreme programming, it's a belief in people over process. Extreme programming, very lightweight, should be lightweight. It's all about that belief in people, not the process itself. It's all about removing as much of the process as possible. Now, these are polar opposite beliefs, and they can happily coexist in the same organization at the same time if you apply them to the right area of the map, if you understand the context. Okay, sometimes beliefs can be exclusive. They cannot exist, but most of them, polar opposites, can happily coexist if you apply them in the right spaces. Okay, so this brings me to culture, because we're talking beliefs and principles. And people would say, right, what's the right culture? And one of my favorite quotes is from Kroger. Despite a century of effort to define culture adequately, there is no agreement among anthropologists regarding its nature. Now, this was about 50 years ago, and today it's still the same position. So if you ask the experts on culture, there is no agreement on what culture actually is. So I love these books in business, which say, you know, this is the culture you want, this is the culture you want, etc. Because, you know, the science is still trying to define what that actually is. And one of my favorite anthropologists is Margaret Mead. She wrote several great books, but one of them talked about language is a discipline of cultural behavior. And that creates a problem. That creates a problem because of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. If language is part of the model of culture, then you will not be able to explain the model of culture completely in language. So it's no surprise they've spent 150 years trying to solve that problem. So I thought, could we map it? Oh, somebody said the map is not the territory. All maps are imperfect representations of a space. Okay, by their very nature, they're imperfect. A map of France, you know, is not an actual representation. Well, it's a representation. It is not France. Okay, to be exactly France, it would have to be one-to-one scale, which would be the size of France, and which of course would be useless as a map. And of course, anybody change anything could be. So all maps are imperfect. They're also built on models, so they're also wrong. But despite being imperfect and wrong, maps tend to be quite useful. So if I go back to this map of HS2, and I look at the scale at the bottom, Genesis, custom, product, commodity, I told you that came from some work I did and developed this particular pattern. Those are in fact labels for physical activities. You have different labels. They all have share the same characteristics. Online, there's something called the cheat sheet. It's about 40 odd, 50 characteristics. They're all shared despite just different labels they use. So stage 1, for physical activities, we say genesis. For practice, novel, data unmodeled, knowledge, concept, observation. They all have the same characteristics. Stage 2, custom, emerging, divergent, hypothesis, etc. Stage 3, product, good, convergent theory. Stage 4, commodity, best, modeled, accepted. And this came out from the text analysis, which I did back in, 2006 on. The point about this is I can pick any stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 label. Okay, they all mean the same. So I could go concept, emerging, convergent, accepted at the bottom. Now, why would you do that? Well, if I'm mapping out values, I might start off with a collective. I might say we sort of have a converging agreement on what a collective is, whether a family, a nation, or a football club. I might say, right, there's an emerging view on universal basic income in this collective, a converging view on paid holiday, and an accepted view on unionization. Well, those things are dependent upon other things as well. And so you can actually start mapping into the entire legal system where where we've codified that, which is accepted. So unionization, anti-discrimination laws, civil rights, and you've also got workers' rights, and the twin pillars of democracy, as Martin Luther King said. And then underneath this, abolition, and then reciprocity and fairness. And all of these components are, of course, evolving. Okay, so you can start to map out the values of a collective. That's great, but that's not culture. I've now got this concept of beliefs and values. And if I take these values at the top and I compress it down, I use this symbol to represent a pipeline. So the square represents a pipeline. It just means there are many values inside of it, all of which are evolving. Universal basic income, paid holiday, workers' rights, etc. Okay, so what do I do now? So I got two groups of people who couldn't agree on anything, Brexiteers and Remainers. Absolutely, anything, they would just go at each other. I thought, great, I'm going to get two groups of them and I'm going to put them in a room. And I said, look, I've got this idea, I want to map culture, and then we can use this to talk about things like Brexit. And they were like, bah, big up. Okay, fine. Well, I've got this concept of values and I've got these principles. And we started with that. And so two groups constantly fighting. They were, by the end, all talking to each other through the medium of maps. And so that's the map of culture they created for me. At the very top, the anchors are we and me, concept of collective we, and me as the individual me. Individuality connected to agency. We as a collective is, well, as a group of people, I should say, the sort of mind of we is about control. Those are both connected to concepts of power, the collective, competition, values, behaviors, concepts of safety, principles, to memory, symbols, rituals, etc. So this is an imperfect approximation of culture, and that's culture, all of it, including all those different pipelines. So it's far from anything simple. And this is also imperfect and wrong, but anyway. So first of all, it's not singular. We belong to many different collectives. You belong to your family, your church. If you belong to a church, your nation, your company. If you belong to a company, you belong to your football, if you've got a football club or whatever it happens to be. Each of those will have, behaviors and values. Secondly, you can't just copy. You can't just go, what are the values of, say, Spotify? Let's copy Spotify's values and we will be Spotify. Nope, because there's all this other stuff going on around it. Right. You can adopt. So you can go, let's look at the principles they're using. We're going to apply those principles to our organization. Fine, you can do that. If it's universally useful, probably a good idea. Okay. And there's feedback loops. Those feedback loops can be positive and negative. So, you know, a collective, we like to succeed in competitions. And one of the things that helps give us a sense of safety is success. And what do we succeed in? Spreading our values, which are represented by our behaviors. And so we get that sense of safety if we're in that group, which all has those behaviors. And so we feel a strong sense of belonging to our collective, and the loop goes around and round and round. You start taking out the collective, the concept of success, you start undermining values or showing that behavior doesn't match to values, you can spin this the other way, destabilize a collective and take it down. And you can often do this with things like art. Art is fantastic for this sort of stuff because art represents memories, symbols, rituals, and we can influence values of a collective through art. And the most powerful form of doing that today is not Hollywood. You know, we used to use that to import values into other cultures, but instead video games. Amazingly powerful. This is Hezbollah's. I think this is their second video game they've released. They're not the only organization doing this sort of stuff. Immersive environments are great for manipulating values and training certain values. Project Violacia, much more positive example here by Sugar Gamers, trying to create positive values within collectives.
Simon, can we just do another quick pause like we did at the last one? So guys, we're at 7:40 here in the UK time. We do have a hard stop at 8 p.m. UK time. So we've got about 20 minutes. Giles and I will just want to do a couple minutes at the end just to wrap up and share what's up next. So, okay, we've got some votes, some keep going. Can anyone type in, how much time do you want for Q&A? Or do you just want to forego Q&A and get Simon on email or LinkedIn? Keep going, keep going, keep going. He's good.
I will keep
There
going.
was one question, Genti. I know you had it. If we don't have time, Genti, maybe you could drop a quick LinkedIn message to Simon, if that's okay, Simon. More Simon.
No,
okay,
no.
we'll switch off the lights.
Okay.
You have it. This is awesome, Simon. Okay,
Well, we're skipping Q&A today. That's fine. Let's just keep going, and we'll just run up to 8 o'clock, and then literally just turn the lights off and watch everybody go.
Okay. Not a problem at all. Or sovereignty might take long. Okay. So let's get into sovereignty. When we talk about things like sovereignty, we talk about physical sovereignty, as in this is our land, and we use a map to represent this. So we go, here's our border, and inside this border is our collective, our behaviors, our values. All, you know, that is all wrapped up in the concept of, there's other bits within there as well, you know, history, our symbols, our art, all that sort of stuff, all part of that culture. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. What about when we talk about economic systems there? Because a lot of people have been talking about digital sovereignty. Okay. Well, that's quite interesting. There's no physical landscape there. There's no map there. So what do we mean by this? So I'm going to show you what I think we mean. This is a self-driving car. This is a map done in DVLA in 2016. This was looking forward to 2025 and onwards. So it was the idea of the components of a car becoming increasingly more and more commodity-like. And as a result of which, that'll make changes to the industry. Because most of this stuff will become increasingly commodity, except for maybe some of the design bits. There'll be intelligent agents and simulation models, etc. And companies will still want to differentiate, so they'll try to do so with status. Oh, there's status in owning the car, but increasingly, if we're in a world where you don't own the car, it's on more on a utility basis, how are they going to recreate status? So there are several things: route management, infotainment, digital subscription models associated with design. Now, this was 2016. I think it was about 2019. BMW started talking digital subscription models. Great. So what are the other things? Well, the first thing is the infotainment. If I'm a gold member, it's a wonderful experience. But if I'm a bronze member, it's wall-to-wall adverts inside. Walmart, blah, maybe outside. And I think it was only a few months ago, BMW said we're looking at e-inking cars. Well, we knew this was coming. Fine. So they'll get their digital subscription models and the e-ink. That's not important. What's important is the route management. So the route management is this. There you are, gold member, and there's all these, lowly bronze in front of you, all self-driving cars. So obviously it's sensible for everybody else's car to get out of the way so you can get to your journey faster. And of course, Ford put forward a patent for this. I think it was about 2020, something like that. That you could do micropayments to move people out of your way in a world of self-driving cars. Now, it sounds great, except for when we have a flood. Because when we have a flood, that basically means all the people with money get out, and all the people who don't are sitting there waiting, what can they do? Their cars are pulling over to the road. The cars with their families are pulling over to allow gold members to get out because, all the gold members are panicked and so forth. Well, this is basically what we call pitchforks, because if this happens, the next day we have pitchforks. We have almighty revolution. And, it's not a good idea to embed social inequality to this extent within particularly transportation systems. It could be a complete disaster. So we knew about this in 2016, but there was another problem. We know that collectives have values, and we know that you can embed those values in simulation models. And our intelligent agents were, the things driving the cars would be built on those simulation models. So now what we've got is the ability to impose values on the systems of another collective. Now we've done this in the past with things like Hollywood, etc. But this is much more low level. So it's like the trolley problem. Cars coming along, do you kill 5 people? Do you kill 1 person? Well, it depends on the values of your collective. If the 1 person is a multi-billionaire and the 5 people are unemployed and your society values money, well, it's tough for the 5 people. If you're much more Confucian-like society, well, it's tough for the 1 person. So the point about this is the values can be embedded in the underlying systems. And, so when we talk about digital sovereignty, what we're really talking about is we should understand our landscape, and it's working out on our landscape, our economic landscape, where our borders should be. Well, what are the things that define our collective, our behaviors, our values? Do we want to actually maintain hold of? I.e., which are the bits we may want to collaborate with others, nations and other organizations on. And this is true also for corporate sovereignty. And which are the bits that we're going to conflict over, the bits that we're going to protect. Now that's what we should be doing, understanding that through our entire supply chains. And that's become ever more clear with things like COVID. But unfortunately, we're not. We're still doing too much of the narrative stuff. So rather than understanding the landscape, lots of people will say, oh, it's really important. Data is really important. Well, it could be. Maybe we really need to think about, it's like the one size fits all. It's like going, what we really need to do is Agile everywhere, or Six Sigma everywhere, or it's AI or whatever it happens to be. We're still in the story mode, but ideally we need to understand the landscape, understand where our borders should be. And of course that actually does depending on us defining what our behaviors and values are in the first place. But that's another conversation about me and we, which we are yet failing to have. The one thing I would say about collaborate and conflict here is they're both competition. People often get confused with this. Competition means seeking together. So competition could be a group of people seeking some result, something. But there's many different ways of doing that, seeking. So one way is conflict. We're going to fight to get there first, okay? One is we're going to work together, fight together, work together, work together, we're going to cooperate. And one way is collaborate. So we're going to labor together to get there. They're all different forms of competition, okay? So when you think about a map, on some bits you're going to conflict with others, some bits you're going to cooperate, some bits you're going to collaborate over. Conflict is, that's like in military terms, that's like the kinetic warfare type things. The thing you try and avoid the most. The art of war is never actually to fire bullets. It's everything else. But all of those are aspects of competition. So I started off with the origin, how I knew nothing. I still know not a great deal, but I know a little bit about maps. I talked about maps and why maps matter, talked about the patterns. So you've got the climatic patterns, these are the rules of the game, useful for prediction. You've got doctrine, useful for organizing, structuring things. You've got gameplay patterns. Once you start getting into this, how to manipulate spaces to your favor. Then I talked a little bit about using maps for organization. That's the whole pioneer settler town planner, unfortunately named. It was a long time ago. It was 2006. Obviously, I was thinking more Vikings, pioneers, not these sort of genocidal concepts of pioneers and settlers, which many nations have embarked upon. So I have to think about a better set of words. But anyway, it's understanding you need at least 3 different types of attitude, at least 3. You also need a system of theft within there, and you need a common language. And then got into culture. There's some interesting stuff going on in culture, particularly the changing of behaviors through and values, basically, through art, which we've always done, but it's just got more refined now. And then finally into sovereignty, which of course is a big issue, but most of it falls into the whole sort of storyland type world, where people are sort of talking about how to deal with sovereignty, but without any maps, which is a bit like doing physical sovereignty without maps. I mean, it's like generals going, what we need to do is capture hills. Great, fine, we'll find a hill and capture it. I mean, from a point of view of competition, it's pretty useless. And at that point, I'm going to stop speaking. I'm sorry. Oh, let's have a look. There's an entire community, by the way, of people mapping. We have something called Map Camp, which up to 1,000 people turn up to. There's online tours. All of this stuff is Creative Commons. The book, I've got a book, medium.com/Wardley Maps. It's all just help yourself. People have turned it into dead tree versions, all this sort of stuff, and there's even awesome list. So I think it is list.wardleymaps.com. Then you put that in there, you'll find a community hub.
We'll share this, Simon, on the ALN site and on the LinkedIn group and everything else as well. So if people want access to it, it'll be here. We'll put it in the comments here on the meetup for today, and we'll put it on the ALN LinkedIn group as well.
I feel like I've had a 5-day course in 90 minutes. Well, one of the things I like to do is, did we record this?
Yes, we have.
We could do a slow watch party if you want to.
Well, we were only talking about this at the start, weren't we?
We were. So I'm happy I've got some hefty research programs going on at the moment, or starting, but I'm happy to find some time. It'll take 3 hours or something like that. And basically have the video, we all watch the video and basically interrupt it. And when there are questions and that sort of thing, and we can dive in a bit more detail. It'll be interesting to do. If you're up for it, it'll be sometime later in the year, but I'll be happy to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is something that absolutely we should organize. Ash and I will take you up on that offer. Absolutely.
Okay, cool. You're on for it. There's loads of Russia and Western tensions, Ukraine. Think about maps. Maps also have perspectives as well. So when one of the interesting aspects of getting groups to communicate is to get them to map and then share the maps. And that came with a whole sort of Brexit Remainer groups. We found people were able to communicate more through the maps than they were in particular story form. But that's not. So maps have been used in things like negotiation and everything else. I don't see, I did mapping for the UN, which was on reducing global poverty. We've seen mapping used. Brazil has a very successful sexual health campaign, which reduces the number of teenage pregnancies, and that was all run in the background through maps, and that's being now copied in Colombia. We've got people using maps to combat slavery. So there's all sorts of different areas maps have been used in. I don't see why it couldn't be used. Whether it is useful or not, it's another question.
Simon, we've got time, I think, just for one question. And
okay.
Look, considering Mike is part of the catalyst of this series, it's only right that we get him to ask what unfortunately will be the only question for today. But Mike, I'd like to welcome you in, and please do ask Simon your question just before we start to wrap up.
Unfortunately, you're probably going to hear the worst question out of all of the possibles, but here we go. Firstly, Simon, thank you. Again, not having dealt with Wardley maps all that much, it does seem to me that the universality of these maps surely, and when I say universality, I guess I mean that many people would agree with where things belong on the map, is dependent on just how concrete the things that you're discussing are. So when it's about components in an organization, that seems fairly concrete. But when you talk about culture and far more abstract things, it becomes then far more contextual. So if it's a capitalist system versus somebody who believes in communism, you're going to get a vastly different map in terms of what they believe their evolutionary process is. But even in an organization, I would imagine that you would get some degree of disagreement. And so how do you deal with that disagreement when people don't think it fully represents what they believe? Or if you have schisms in an organization who want to see it slightly differently for their own purposes.
Okay, so fascinating question. So first of all, when it comes to agreement on where things are, physical activities, you get disagreement in that space alone. I had 100 CIOs. I put them in the room. All different organizations. And I said, right, who has ERP? Enterprise Resource Planning, 100 hands went up. And I said, well, it must be a commodity then. Huge amount of argument. All right, everybody, no, it's not, because they were all custom. It was all custom. And I was saying, well, that doesn't make sense. So I asked a couple of them, what are the customizations that you're doing? And they were like, secret source, blah, blah, gives our advantage. And Badger. And they eventually told me 2. And I asked, anybody else got these? All 100 hands went up. And then we just started going through the list, and they're all customized exactly the same way. And this group is spending about 8 billion a year customizing the same system in identical ways, creating no value whatsoever, except for offer to the vendor. And the reason why they're doing this all is because they've got no way of communicating. So one of the key things about maps is it provides a mechanism for different people to communicate. And that's the first place that we have to start. We do get disagreement on the placement of things. And then we have things like the cheat sheet, or you can do, surveys and get people to place things and take the aggregate. So when we have like many government departments, you'll get people putting, user registration in, most of them think it's commodity, a few think it's custom built. And when you see that, you've got bias, and it can either be because genuinely it is a commodity, not a custom built, or there is some reason, some other need, some other aspect which hasn't been looked at. Now, when it comes to cultural systems, it's interesting with the whole sort of Brexit Remainers, because we could agree on an idea of we. And this is, I've got to stick within the UK here, because we means something completely different, I found out in the US. But in the idea of we in the UK, we could get to an agreement on that. But the actual details of the we were different. So there was, in the case of the Brexiteers, the we was all of us against this elite group who were trying to in Europe, trying to manipulate in whatever way, etc. And the Remainers had the we is all of us, including Europe, and the against this elite group. So they both had these concepts of like me and we within there. Just the details were slightly different, but we could agree. And it was in the process of being able to do that, we could start to discuss some of the interconnections between these components in a way we can do with stores. I'm just mindful of the time. I'll just share one thing with you very, very, very quickly. Tweets. Hang on a second, let me find it. Economic methods. So you mentioned communism, capitalism, etc. So I did a survey in 2015 because I was struggling with a problem. Let me share. Because I was investigating China and doing comparisons, US versus China, basically looking at value streams and all this sort of stuff. So at the top, this is a US-centric view of economic thought. Underneath this is a European-centric view of economic thought. I got economists trained in the same area to define, on a scale of century plan to laissez-faire, just to place economists. And there was 140 odd people in total, or something like that, 120 people. And so in the US, Marx and Keynes were over here. This was the less effective communist model. And Smith, Hayek, Friedman over here, laissez-faire. Now, if you go to Europe, exactly the same economists, completely different position on the scale. Friedman's over here, laissez-faire, that's where Europe thinks the US operates. Marx is over here, and in the middle are Keynes, Smith, and Hayek. Okay? And so when you talk to people in the US about how China operates, they think China's like this Marxist company, organization over here. But if you look in Europe, they think it operates like Keynes, Smith, and Hayek, and the extreme is the Friedman in the US. So even simple things. So when you start mapping out the connections and everything else, even simple terms, it's like we. We doesn't mean the same in the US as it does in Europe. And we means a group of individuals, fundamentally in the US. Whereas in Europe, it has very strong connotations in a different way. And of course, that's a generalization, but So how do you deal with it? The only thing I can do is say, use the map to allow people to discuss and talk, and it's through that process that we tease out. We start to discover these things, and things just we can't agree on some bits. And then what we have to do is unpack that even more, because we often find that we can agree on parts of that thing, but there's some components, some perspective, some need that we're missing. And once we get to that, then things often become a little bit clearer. Did that help at all?
It did, but I'm guessing out of that disagreement, you can then start, and I hate using the word, but start managing problems that may come from those disagreements. So at least give that insight. Yeah.
But one other thing is to get the disagreement on the map and away from the story. The stories are so loaded with politics, because when you challenge somebody's story, you are literally saying you're not a good leader, because we tell everybody good leaders are good storytellers. It's a dreadful thing to do. Getting it at least on the map means we can point to the map, and I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying there's something funny with the map. I think something wrong with the map. And so you deflect it all. And that's been a huge help. There's no way I would have got Brexiteers and Remainers to talk together if I hadn't used a map.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon.
Pleasure.
Can I just say, Simon, we just got to say thank you. Can we just give a big massive round of applause, please, to Simon for an awesome presentation today. Seriously, thank you very much for coming along and doing this. Look, it's even
Pleasure.
great. Nigel is here as well. Nigel kickstarted us, obviously, as Ashley rightly reminded us all at the tail end of last year. We had, obviously, Dave a few weeks ago, Simon, and obviously, I think it's March the 8th. Is that right, Ash? Yeah, March the 8th. We've got the big panel event coming up as well. So, you know, I'm super excited to see the final episode of this. But I just wanted to, you know, pass on my appreciation from everybody here today as well, Simon. Thank you very much indeed for such an awesome presentation, such an awesome talk. And we will take you up on the slow replay, slow walkthrough as well.
That'll be interesting.
At some point later in the year, because I think there's many people who've asked for that in the chat as well. So yeah, we're certainly going to sign you up for an extra special, extra long ALN session.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you. Now, we've got, in 2 weeks' time, we've got, obviously, one of our community friends, Alkesh, coming and talking about, Ash, please do remind me.
Bringing innovation to quarterly planning.
Thank you. There we go. So that's in 2 weeks. And then, as I said, followed on, the next one after that is March the 8th. And I am just really excited. This is going to be the final wrap up of this entire series. I think it's kind of slightly anticlimactic, well, because, you know, we're finishing the sort of seemingly, you know, at the start of the year. We needed this to sort of continue for the next 11 months of 2022.
Or is it the beginning, Giles?
I know,
is it the wrap up? Is it the beginning of something new? Wild and wonderful.
It's great. And look, it's, as I said, the other thing is it's the community keeping coming back, you know, every time, every 2-3 weeks we put something on. It's just great that you guys keep coming back from wherever you are in the world. We're really appreciating it. So look, Simon, again, thank you very much indeed. Everyone else, have a great rest of the day wherever you are in the world, and look forward to seeing you either in a couple of weeks or on the 8th of March. So see you all soon. And Simon, once again, thanks very much.